How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to Boylai Hobby Time. I thought it would be fun this week to make some interacting bookends, with the Death Star firing its laser on one end and an unlucky planet being destroyed on the other. For the Death Star lasers, I'll be using these green COB raindrop lights. I'll have one on each side for a cool pass-through effect. For the unfortunate planet that will be receiving the green beam, I found this foam ball, which might be a little too large, but it will convey the sheer power of the Death Star, which is insignificant next to the power of the Force. And for the Death Star, I'll be using this Death Star. It is the Death Star II, which I don't think got to destroy many planets, but it was the most readily available Death Star I could find, so it will do just fine. This second Death Star is the second Death Star kit from Bondi that I've assembled on this channel, but it's been a few years since I did that, which is wild to say. I never guessed that I'd be doing weekly videos when I started this channel 218 videos ago. Because the filament is not perfectly round, I had to carve out little notches on the top and the bottom of the hole to allow the light to pass through, and I'm quite happy with the snug fit. There was some material on the inside of the Death Star that needed to be carved away in order to make room for the back end of the light, and after that had been scraped away, everything fit like a charm. Once I knew I didn't have any spacing issues to worry about with the lighting, I began assembling the back half of this That's No Moon. Before closing up the front, I needed to figure out a pathway for the wiring, which originally I thought was going to go out through the bottom. But I decided that the levitating effect would be more fun to look at. So I figured out the spacing when compared to the planet, and I drilled a hole for the filament in the vertical board. Now, obviously this little filament is not strong enough to support the weight of a space station, so I needed an additional hole on the model as well as on the board, which will support the Death Star and also be the conduit for the wiring that powers the laser. And speaking of wires, that is the next thing that I did. After adding some flux to the terminals, I soldered the wires in place. I then drilled a couple holes in the Death Star, and I pulled my wires through. I also pulled them back through the brass tube, and to make sure that the tube and the filament stayed parallel with each other, I wrapped them both in one piece of clear heat shrink. The heat shrink carries the light and has the added benefit of hiding the brass tube from a wider angle when the light is on. I drilled a hole in another piece of wood, which I glued to the back. This will act as additional support for the tube and keep everything level. Once the Death Star had been glued in place, I glued the upright board to the horizontal one. And that's all for the left bookend for now, but we'll be back to it in a few minutes. Now it's time to shift our attention to the victim, or should I say victims, of the Death Star. First things first was to drill another hole for the second filament that mirrored the first one. I carved the same little notches just like before, and this one is oriented the same way, so the large part is behind the board this time. I used the location of the light to mark out the placement of the impact of the beam on the planet, and I used the side of a drill to carve that out. I then broke out my hot wire, and it was a matter of carving large cracks where the shell of the planet would have been beginning to split a split second before completely exploding. Once all the pieces were free, I took a little bit extra off the edges in a couple places and I glued them back together in their shattered state. And yes, the planet is bigger than I had expected, but that's okay. The next step was to cover this planet in a protective layer of Mod Podge. I started with the plain vanilla Mod Podge, but that was too hard to see, so I switched to Butterscotch. While that dries, let's move back to the Death Star and mask off the beam so that we can move on to painting. And while I paint this thing, I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons. I started the painting by priming everything black with an acrylic primer sprayed on with the airbrush, and it looks really dark while it's wet, but when it dries it gets a little lighter. That is not the case though with the black 4.0. After the primer, I threw a light gray on the DS from above, bringing out the highlights with a light dry brushing of an even lighter gray. And that was pretty much the entirety of my experience painting the Death Star 2. When that was done, it was time to paint the void of space. I thinned down my black 4.0 so it would flow better through the airbrush, and gave each backdrop one coat. On the left, you can see me covering the standard black with the black 4.0. With my eerily black background behind the Death Star, it was time to add some live stars using white paint and the end of a copper wire. There's absolutely nothing special about this technique. What you do is dip the wire in some paint and poke it randomly. And I honestly think it's pretty convincing. I repeated the same technique on the other side, and unfortunately the effect isn't that visible in the dark, but when it's on the shelf during the day, I think it will look pretty cool. After that, I removed the masking tape from the beam, and the painting of the Death Star and the backdrops was done, and by this time the planet had dried and it was ready to be painted as well. I started with the same black acrylic primer. I also painted some sun orange on the inside of the ball, between the cracks, so that if there was any remaining white, it would be orange instead. I then moved back to the outside of the planet and I painted on the same light from the unseen source that's lighting up the Death Star. I blocked in the land masses using a yellowish green and some deeper blue for the water, and then I put some clouds and atmosphere over top. I was just kind of going off of intuition rather than using a photo reference, and it shows. So I don't think I ended up with something as planety as I would have liked, but it's still mostly recognizable as a planet from a distance when the lights are off. The next step was to cut out a back plate which could hold the internal LEDs. I did this using a sheet of clear acrylic. I cut that off camera on my bandsaw, and after peeling off the protective wrap, I broke out my little plastic bag of 3-volt warm white LED filaments. To fix these slippery silicone filaments in place, I put 2 rings of clear heat shrink on each one. Glue sticks to that. I glued them in place following a pattern of cracks that I had traced from the ball onto the base. When my little filament petri dish was complete, I tested the polarity of each filament, and then I marked out the positive end of each one. I then wired everything up in parallel by connecting all the positives to one wire and all the negatives to another. That keeps the voltage requirement at 3 volts. If you wired up all the filaments together one after another, positive to negative, you'd need 3 extra volts per filament, which in this case would be 45 volts, and I don't have that many batteries. Next, I drilled the spot where the support for the planet would go, and I painted the back of the acrylic sheet with a white spray primer. I then glued that to the planet, and I glued the planet in place. Like I mentioned earlier, I have posted 218 videos, almost consecutively, week by week, but I'm going to be taking 2 weeks off. I'm not using those 2 weeks to build a bigger project like I usually do. I'm actually going to take that time off, and I'm looking forward to it. But if you need your weekly dose of Boil Eye hobby time, go back and watch some of my older videos. You can tell me how much my voice has changed since I started, and let me know which ones are your favorite. We can all reminisce together. The last thing to do on this project was to clean up the sides using some wooden veneer. I've had quite a few paper cuts in my life, and a few cardboard cuts and other random cuts, but on this project I got my very first wooden veneer cut. And I wasn't filming when it happened, but I did recreate it for you guys to see. The first couple takes were a little too dramatic. On the plus side, I now have another thing to add to the list of non-serious injuries that can occur while hobby timing. Because these bookends are likely going to end up on a wooden bookshelf, I decided to stain the veneer to match the wood rather than painting them black. And I also think that helps the space effect stand out a little bit more. The last thing to do was to wipe off the excess stain and leave them to dry. And after that, I called it good. If you or a loved one likes things that glow green, CrowdMade is making a limited edition glowing pin and shirt with kids sizes, which will only be available through the end of October. Links to those will be in the description. That is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Huge shout out as always to my patrons. You guys are the best. Have an awesome couple weeks, everyone. I'll see you next time.